When Malachi Bennett lands his dream job at the prestigious Meridian Enterprises, it feels like the culmination of years of hard work and his chance to give his mother, Leona, the life she deserves. But on his first day, a fleeting glance from the powerful CEO, Victor Langston, sends an unsettling chill through him, one he can't quite explain. What begins as a promising career quickly unravels into a journey of betrayal and buried secrets when Malachi discovers that the man he has admired from afar is more than just his boss. He's the father who abandoned him and destroyed his mother's future. As Malachi delves into the past, he uncovers a twisted web of lies, manipulation, and deceit, masterminded not only by Victor but by his calculating wife, Eleanor Langston. Fueled by anger and a thirst for justice, Malachi steps into the shadows of his family's darkest truths, threatening to dismantle the empire built on their lies. But as the fragile threads binding their lives begin to snap, Malachi must decide how far he's willing to go to reclaim his mother's dignity and his own identity. Will confronting his father bring closure, or will it destroy everything he holds dear? The Shadows of Legacy is a gripping story of betrayal, resilience, and redemption, where the pursuit of truth comes at a cost and forgiveness becomes the ultimate strength. For Malachi, the shadows of the past may hold the key to the future he's always dreamed of, or a legacy of pain he's destined to repeat. The faint aroma of brewed coffee lingered in the small but cozy kitchen of Leona Bennett's apartment. Malachi adjusted the tie on his freshly pressed shirt in the mirror by the front door. His sharp amber eyes reflected a mix of excitement and nerves. "Malachi, you're going to be late if you keep fiddling with that tie," Leona called from the kitchen. Her warm, familiar voice filled the space, wrapping around Malachi like a blanket. I know, he replied, finally tightening the knot to his satisfaction. He stepped into the kitchen, where Leona handed him a travel mug of coffee. "Thanks, Mom. You're the best." Leona smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She smoothed a wrinkle on his shirt and stepped back, her hands lingering in midair as though reluctant to let him go. "Big day," she said softly. "Your first real job." "Yeah, it's huge," Malachi said, his grin wide. "Meridian Enterprises. This is everything we've worked for. All those late-night study sessions, the internships, the applications. It's finally paying off." Leona nodded, but her gaze shifted to the mug in her hands. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice steady but laced with an undertone he couldn't quite place. "Hey, you okay?" Malachi asked, setting down his briefcase. "You seem off." "I'm fine," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just nerves for you." "It's a big step." Malachi frowned, but decided to let it go. "Thanks for everything, Mom. I'm going to make you proud. You'll see." Leona's smile faltered as he walked out the door. The towering Meridian Enterprises building gleamed in the morning sun, its sleek glass facade reflecting the bustling city around it. Malachi stepped inside the grand lobby, taking in the high ceilings, marble floors, and polished atmosphere. A woman in a sharp suit approached him. "Malachi Bennett?" she asked, her tone brisk. "Yes, that's me," he said, extending his hand. "Lauren Knight, your supervisor." "Welcome to Meridian," she said, shaking his hand briefly before leading him toward the elevators. "We'll start with a tour." As they ascended to the 40th floor, Lauren spoke about the company's history and departments, but Malachi's attention was drawn to the man standing across the hall when the elevator doors opened. Victor Langston, the CEO himself, was speaking to a group of executives. His commanding presence was impossible to ignore. Their eyes met briefly, and Malachi felt a jolt of something he couldn't explain. "Come on," Lauren said, snapping him out of his thoughts. Victor's gaze lingered on Malachi as he passed. The 40th floor offices were everything Malachi imagined. Sleek, modern, and intimidating. Lauren stopped outside a large door. "Mr. Langston would like to see you," she said. "Me?" Malachi asked, caught off guard. "Don't keep him waiting," she replied before walking away. Malachi entered the room, his heart pounding. Victor Langston sat behind an expansive mahogany desk, his eyes sharp and unreadable. The panoramic view of the city behind him added to his imposing presence. "Mr. Bennett," Victor said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "Have a seat." "Thank you, sir," Malachi said, his voice steady despite his nerves. Victor studied him for a moment. "Tell me about yourself, your background, your ambitions." Malachi spoke about his education and aspirations, trying to project confidence. Victor listened intently, but his gaze felt probing, almost as if he were searching for something deeper. "You have potential," Victor said finally, leaning back in his chair. "I expect great things from you." "Thank you, sir. I won't disappoint," Malachi replied, though unease coiled in his chest. Victor nodded, dismissing him with a polite but distant smile. As Malachi left the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that Victor's interest in him wasn't purely professional. That evening, Malachi sat at the kitchen table, recounting his day to Leona. She listened quietly, her hands gripping her mug tightly. "And then I met Victor Langston," Malachi said, unable to keep the awe out of his voice. "He even asked to meet with me personally. Can you believe that?" Leona froze, her expression unreadable. "Victor Langston?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah. Why?" Malachi asked, frowning. "Do you know him?" Leona hesitated, the color draining from her face. "Malachi, there's something I need to tell you." His stomach tightened. "What is it?" Leona took a deep breath. "Victor Langston. He's your father." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Malachi stared at her, his mind reeling. "What? No, that's not possible." "I wish it weren't," Leona said, her voice cracking. "But it's the truth. When I told him I was pregnant, he turned his back on me. He fired me and made sure I couldn't work in the industry again." Malachi shot to his feet, his chest heaving. "He ruined your career? He just left us? And you never told me?" "I was trying to protect you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't want you to grow up with that pain." "Well, now I have it anyway," Malachi said, his voice shaking with anger. "And he's been living like none of it happened." Later that night, Malachi sat in his bedroom, staring at the city lights outside his window. His mother's revelation replayed in his mind, each word cutting deeper. The man he had admired from afar wasn't a hero. He was a coward. Malachi clenched his fists, the weight of his mother's sacrifices pressing down on him. He thought about her years of struggle, her quiet strength in the face of adversity. "I can't let this go," he whispered to himself. "He has to answer for what he did." The next morning, Malachi left the apartment with a new resolve. He would confront Victor Langston, not just as an employee, but as the son he abandoned. It was time to uncover the truth and demand justice, for himself and for Leona. Malachi sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The previous night's revelation gnawed at him. How could the man who had caused his mother so much pain now hold the power to influence his career? The irony felt like a cruel joke. Victor Langston strode through the office, his commanding presence impossible to ignore. Malachi tensed as Victor's gaze briefly flicked in his direction. Their eyes met for the second time in as many days. Victor's expression remained unreadable, but Malachi couldn't help feeling like the CEO was studying him. "Morning," Victor said casually as he passed by. Malachi managed a curt nod, his jaw tightening. "Good morning, sir." Victor paused, his sharp hazel eyes lingering for just a moment longer. "I trust you're settling in well?" "Yes, sir," Malachi replied, keeping his tone professional despite the churn of emotions in his chest. "Good. Let's see how you handle the pace around here," Victor said before moving on, leaving Malachi with a mix of anger and apprehension. Malachi clenched his fists under the desk. He knew he couldn't let this stand, but he wasn't ready to confront Victor yet. Later that evening, Malachi sat across from his mother at their small dining table. Leona's hands trembled slightly as she sipped her tea. The silence between them was heavy. "Mom," Malachi said, breaking the quiet, "I need to know more. About him. About what happened." Leona set her cup down, her gaze distant. "I told you everything that mattered." "No, you didn't," Malachi pressed. "You told me he abandoned you. But why? How? What did he say? I need to understand." Leona sighed deeply, the weight of the past pressing down on her. "Victor and we were young. I worked at Meridian when it was just starting. She hesitated, her voice cracking. "We had an affair." Malachi's stomach twisted. "What happened when you told him about me?" Leona looked down at her hands. "He didn't want a scandal. He said he had a reputation to protect, a family to think about. Then his wife, Eleanor, found out. She's the one who made sure I was fired, that I couldn't find work in the industry." "Eleanor?" Malachi repeated, the name unfamiliar but already stirring anger in him. "She's ruthless, Malachi," Leona said, her voice trembling. "Victor might have been weak, but Eleanor, she made sure I stayed down. She didn't just take away my career. She took away my dignity." Malachi's jaw tightened. And now he's pretending like nothing happened, living his perfect life. Leona placed a hand over his. "Promise me you'll be careful, Malachi. They're powerful people. You don't know what they're capable of." Malachi met her eyes, his resolve hardening. "I need to do this, Mom. For you. For me." Malachi couldn't shake the feeling of determination as he walked into the Midtown Bistro, a high-end restaurant frequented by the city's elite. He'd overheard his co-workers mentioning Victor's dinner plans with his family. Now, he was here to confront him, not as an employee, but as a son demanding answers. Victor sat at a corner table with his wife, Eleanor, and their son, Elijah. The three of them looked like the picture-perfect family. Eleanor's poised elegance and Elijah's polished demeanor contrasted sharply with the storm brewing in Malachi's chest. Malachi approached the table, his heart pounding. Victor noticed him first, his expression tightening with recognition. "Malachi?" he said, his voice low and wary. Eleanor glanced up, her sharp blue-gray eyes narrowing. "Who is this?" Malachi didn't hesitate. "I'm your employee, Mrs. Langston. But more importantly, I'm Victor's son." The air at the table turned icy. Eleanor's face froze, and Elijah's fork clattered onto his plate. Victor's usually calm demeanor cracked, his jaw tightening as he stared at Malachi. "Malachi," Victor said in a controlled voice, "this isn't the time or place." "Oh, I think it is," Malachi replied, his tone sharp. "You've had 24 years to explain yourself. I think you owe me, and my mother, an answer." Eleanor's gaze darted to Victor, her voice cutting. What is he talking about, Victor? Victor rubbed his temple, avoiding her gaze. It's complicated. It's simple, Malachi snapped. You abandoned my mother when she was pregnant. You let your wife ruin her career. You left us with nothing. Elijah's shocked voice broke the silence. Dad, is this true? Victor remained silent, his guilt written all over his face. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. You had no right to come here and disrupt our family, she said coldly. No right? Malachi shot back. You destroyed mine. Malachi stormed into his apartment, his hands still trembling from the confrontation. Leona sat on the couch, her eyes filled with worry the moment she saw him. What did you do? She asked, standing. I confronted him. At dinner. With his family, Malachi admitted, pacing the room. Leona's face paled. Malachi, no. Do you know what you've done? They won't let this go. Eleanor. I don't care, Malachi interrupted. They've had their lies for years. It's time they faced the truth. But at what cost? Leona said, her voice breaking. I don't want you getting hurt because of me. This isn't just about you. Mom, Malachi said, his voice softening. It's about us. About making sure they don't get to keep living like nothing happened. Leona wrapped her arms around herself, her eyes glassy with tears. I just don't want you to lose yourself in this. Malachi looked at her, his resolve firm. I won't. But I'm not backing down. In the quiet of his room, Malachi stared at the stack of notes he'd begun compiling on Victor, Eleanor, and Meridian Enterprises. He knew the fight wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. His phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from a coworker, one he barely knew. The subject line read, I heard about the dinner. Call me. Malachi frowned. What did this stranger know? The idea of allies or enemies within Meridian sent a chill through him. The office was quiet, except for the steady hum of computers and occasional murmurs of conversations. Malachi sat at his desk, scrolling through online archives about the Langston family. Article after article painted them as a power couple. Victor, the self-made CEO, and Eleanor, the polished socialite who seemed to excel at making problems disappear. Meridian wouldn't be what it is today without Eleanor Langston, one feature article read. Her connections in high society opened doors for Victor's fledgling business, ensuring its place among the city's elite. Malachi clenched his jaw. The glowing words about Eleanor's strategic prowess only added to the picture Leona had painted of a woman who would stop at nothing to protect her family's reputation. Find anything interesting? A voice asked. Malachi turned to see Lauren Knight, his supervisor, leaning against the edge of his cubicle. Just doing some research, he said, closing the tab quickly. Lauren raised an eyebrow. I heard about the scene at the bistro. Word travels fast around here. Great, Malachi muttered. Lauren leaned closer, lowering her voice. Look, I don't know what's going on between you and the Langstons, but if you're digging, be careful. Eleanor's reputation for playing dirty isn't just gossip. Malachi nodded. Thanks for the warning. But he wasn't deterred. If anything, Lauren's words fueled his determination. Eleanor Langston wasn't just protecting her family. She was hiding something. That evening, Malachi sat across from Leona in their living room. Her hands twisted anxiously in her lap, her worry evident. You're going to get yourself hurt, Malachi, she said, her voice trembling. You don't know what those people are capable of. I'm not scared of them, Malachi said firmly. Eleanor might have power, but she's not invincible. Leona shook her head. She's more dangerous than you think. She doesn't just ruin people's careers. She destroys lives. I barely made it out with you. Exactly, Malachi said. You shouldn't have had to go through that. I'm not going to let them get away with it. Sometimes justice isn't worth the cost, Leona said, her voice breaking. Malachi leaned forward, his eyes softening. Mom, I'm doing this because of everything you sacrificed. I want them to answer for what they did to you. To us. Leona sighed, tears glistening in her eyes. Just promise me you'll be careful. I promise, Malachi said, though he knew caution alone wouldn't be enough. The Langston estate was quiet when Elijah returned home that night. He found Victor in the study, nursing a glass of whiskey. Dad, we need to talk, Elijah said, closing the door behind him. Victor sighed. Not now, Elijah. Yes, now, Elijah pressed. What's going on with Malachi? He says he's your son, and you haven't denied it. Victor swirled his drink, staring into the amber liquid. It's complicated. No, Elijah said, his voice rising. It's simple. Either he's lying, or you've been lying to us my entire life. Victor's shoulders slumped. I made mistakes, Elijah. Ones I thought I'd buried. Burying them doesn't make them go away. Elijah snapped. Do you realize what this could do to us? To the company? Victor looked up, his hazel eyes tired. I know, and I'm trying to figure out how to make it right. Then start by telling me the truth, Elijah said, his voice cold. Because if you don't, Malachi will. Late into the night, Malachi sat surrounded by documents he'd managed to pull from public records. One, in particular, caught his attention. A memo from years ago, signed by Eleanor Langston. The language was subtle but clear. A directive to terminate Leona Bennett due to performance concerns, paired with instructions to quietly blacklist her within the industry. Malachi's stomach churned. Victor might have been complicit, but Eleanor had orchestrated it all. Got you, Malachi muttered, snapping a photo of the document with his phone. The weight of what he'd uncovered left him conflicted. He wanted to confront Victor, but this wasn't just his fight anymore. Eleanor was the mastermind, and she wasn't going to go down without a fight. The next morning, Malachi sat in a coffee shop, staring at the evidence he'd gathered. His mind raced with possibilities. He couldn't bring Eleanor down alone, but he didn't have to. A buzz on his phone drew his attention. It was an email from an anonymous sender. I know what you're looking for. Meet me at the park. Noon. Malachi's pulse quickened. Someone else knew about the Langston's secrets. The question was, were they friend or foe? As he packed up his things, a new resolve settled over him. He wasn't just going to expose the truth. He was going to make the Langstons face the full weight of their actions. The Langston mansion was eerily quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by tension so thick it could choke. Elijah stormed into the grand living room, where Eleanor sat poised on an elegant velvet chair. She looked up, startled by the force of his entry. Elijah, she said, her tone a warning. What is the meaning of this? I want the truth, Elijah demanded, his hazel eyes blazing with anger. About Malachi, about Dad, about what you've done. Eleanor's expression hardened. What I've done? Don't take that tone with me. Don't deflect, Elijah snapped. I overheard you on the phone this morning. You were talking about covering this up. What are you hiding? Eleanor stood, smoothing the front of her tailored blouse as if preparing for battle. I was protecting this family. Everything I've ever done was to ensure your father's success and our legacy. That includes dealing with complications. Complications? Elijah repeated, his voice rising. You mean ruining a woman's life? Blacklisting her? You turned my father into a monster, and now Malachi is paying the price for it. Don't be naive, Eleanor said coldly. This world doesn't reward weakness, Elijah. Leona Bennett was a liability, and I handled it. Elijah stared at her, disgust written across his face. You handled it? You mean you destroyed her? And now Malachi, your own flesh and blood, is fighting to fix what you broke. I can't even look at you. Eleanor's face didn't falter, but her voice softened slightly. You think I wanted this? I made sacrifices for this family, for you. One day you'll understand. No, I won't, Elijah said, turning on his heel. I'm done with this family's lies. In the warm confines of their apartment, Malachi sat at the kitchen table while Leona brewed tea. The familiar scent of chamomile filled the air, a soothing contrast to the turmoil in his heart. I confronted Eleanor, Malachi said, breaking the silence. Leona turned, her face pale. Malachi, what are you doing? I needed to see the person who destroyed your life, Malachi replied, his voice tight. She didn't even flinch. She was proud of it, Mom, like it was some twisted badge of honor. Leona placed the teapot on the table and sat across from him. Her hands trembled as she reached for his. You're playing a dangerous game, Malachi. Eleanor Langston isn't someone you corner without consequences. She's not invincible, Malachi said, his jaw tightening. Leona squeezed his hand. She might not be, but you need to ask yourself if this fight is worth losing yourself over. I've already lost so much. I can't lose you too. Malachi's eyes softened. I'm doing this for you, Mom, to make things right. Leona's expression was a mix of pride and fear. Just remember, justice isn't always about bringing others down. Sometimes, it's about lifting yourself up. Victor sat in his dimly lit office, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. The sharp knock at the door startled him. Come in, he said, his voice weary. Malachi stepped inside, closing the door behind him. We need to talk. Victor gestured to the chair across from his desk. I suppose we do. Malachi didn't sit. Instead, he leaned against the edge of the desk, his amber eyes locked on Victor's. Why didn't you stop her? Eleanor, you knew what she did to my mother. Victor sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. You think it was that simple? That I could stand up to her and everything would be fine? You're the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, Malachi said, his voice sharp. You had power. You chose not to use it. Victor's gaze dropped to his hands. I was a coward. I thought I could keep my family intact by staying silent. I didn't realize how much damage that silence would cause. Your silence destroyed my mother's life, Malachi said, his voice shaking with anger. Victor looked up, guilt etched into every line of his face. I know, and it's haunted me every day since. Haunted you? Malachi spat. That's all you have to say? Victor stood, his voice steady but tinged with regret. I can't undo the past, Malachi, but I can try to make things right now. Malachi stared at him for a long moment, the weight of Victor's words hanging in the air. Prove it. The Langston estate was buzzing with whispers of the latest scandal, but Eleanor sat in her study, calm and composed. When the door opened, she barely glanced up. Victor, she said, her tone clipped. I assume this is about your latest lapse in judgment. Victor stepped inside, his expression grim. This has gone too far, Eleanor. We need to own up to what we've done. What you've done, Eleanor corrected, her eyes narrowing. Don't drag me into your guilt. You orchestrated everything, Victor shot back. Leona's firing, the blacklisting. You made sure she couldn't rebuild her life. Eleanor stood, her sharp gaze cutting through him. And you let me. Don't pretend you're blameless now just because your conscience finally caught up with you. This isn't just about me anymore, Victor said, his voice rising. It's about Malachi. He deserves better than our lies. Eleanor's lips curled into a cold smile. Malachi? That boy is nothing more than a threat to everything we've built. Victor slammed his fist on the desk, the sound echoing through the room. He's your husband's son. And if you think I'm going to let you ruin his life too, you're sorely mistaken. Eleanor didn't flinch. Do what you want, Victor. But don't expect me to sit idly by while you hand him the keys to our empire. Malachi sat in the quiet of his room, the evidence he'd gathered spread out before him. Photos, emails, memos, all pointing to the truth Eleanor had worked so hard to bury. His phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from a journalist he'd contacted earlier that week. We're running the story tomorrow. Are you sure about this? Malachi hesitated, his mother's voice echoing in his mind. Justice isn't always about bringing others down, but as he stared at the documents, the memories of Leona's sacrifices flooded back. The long nights, the tears she'd hidden, the dreams she'd given up to ensure he had a chance. He typed his response. Run it? The fallout began the next morning. News outlets buzzed with headlines exposing the Langstons' unethical practices. At Meridian, whispers turned to open discussions, and Victor's once commanding presence seemed to shrink with every passing hour. As Malachi walked through the office, he felt a mix of triumph and uncertainty. The truth was out, but what came next was a question he wasn't ready to answer. The newsroom buzzed with energy as the article exposing the Langstons' secrets hit the media. Headlines plastered across the internet read, Meridian Enterprises Scandal. CEO's family secrets exposed. In the sleek Meridian Enterprises office, whispers and uneasy glances passed between employees. Malachi sat at his desk, bracing for the fallout. Across the office, Lauren Knight approached him with a cautious expression. Malachi, she said in a low voice, it's all over the news. Everyone's talking about it. I know, Malachi replied, his voice steady. It had to be done. Lauren hesitated. Victor's in damage control mode, but I don't think even he can fix this. As if on cue, a company-wide email pinged onto everyone's screens. The subject line read, Statement from the Board of Directors. Malachi clicked it open. Effective immediately, Victor Langston has stepped down as CEO of Meridian Enterprises. We are committed to maintaining the integrity and reputation of our company as we navigate this difficult time. Malachi stared at the screen, the weight of the moment sinking in. He had won, but the victory felt hollow. Eleanor Langston sat in her opulent living room, scrolling through the endless stream of articles tarnishing the Langston name. The phone calls from friends, once constant, had gone silent. The door opened, and Victor stepped inside. His shoulders slumped. Congratulations, Eleanor said bitterly. You've managed to destroy everything we built. Victor sighed, sinking into an armchair across from her. This isn't about me, Eleanor. This is about the choices we made. The choices you made, she snapped. I did what was necessary to protect this family. If you had any backbone, you'd have done the same. Victor met her gaze, his voice calm but firm. Protecting the family doesn't mean destroying innocent people. You crossed a line, and now we're paying for it. Eleanor's hands tightened into fists. And what about Malachi? You choose him over us? This isn't about choosing sides, Victor said. It's about taking responsibility. Eleanor scoffed, rising to her feet. Responsibility? Don't talk to me about responsibility. I've carried this family while you wallowed in guilt. You're weak, Victor. And now we've lost everything because of you. Victor didn't reply, his silence speaking volumes. The next morning, Malachi opened the door to find Victor standing on the threshold, a hesitant expression on his face. Malachi, Victor began, his voice heavy with emotion. I need to talk to you. And to your mother. Malachi's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside, allowing Victor in. Leona emerged from the kitchen, freezing when she saw him. Victor, she said, her voice cold. What are you doing here? I came to apologize, Victor said, his tone earnest. To both of you. I can't undo what I've done, but I want to make amends. Leona crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Victor swallowed hard. I've already stepped down from Meridian. I've also arranged for the company to establish a scholarship fund in your name, Leona. For young professionals like you who deserve a second chance. Malachi and Leona exchanged a glance, the weight of Victor's words sinking in. It's a start, Malachi said finally, but it doesn't erase the past. I know, Victor said quietly, but it's all I can do now. I just hope one day you can forgive me. Elijah stood at the edge of the Langston Estate's vast garden, staring out at the horizon. Malachi approached him, their first meeting since the scandal broke. You came, Elijah said, his tone unreadable. I wasn't sure if I should, Malachi admitted, but I thought we needed to talk. Elijah turned to face him, his hazel eyes filled with a mix of anger and sadness. You've torn our family apart. That wasn't my intention, Malachi said. I just wanted the truth to come out. Elijah exhaled sharply. I don't even know who my parents are anymore. My father lied. My mother. He shook his head. She's not the person I thought she was. They made mistakes, Malachi said, his voice softer. But we don't have to let their choices define us. Elijah studied him for a long moment. I don't know if I can forgive them, but I think I can start with you. Malachi offered a tentative smile. Maybe we can figure it out together. In the quiet of Leona's apartment, Malachi sat with his mother, the weight of the past few weeks beginning to lift. I think I'm done with Meridian, Malachi said, breaking the silence. Leona looked up from her tea. What will you do instead? Something that's mine, Malachi replied. Something that honors what you've taught me. Leona smiled, pride shining in her eyes. Whatever you choose, I know you'll make it great. Malachi reached across the table, taking her hand. We made it, Mom. We survived. Leona squeezed his hand gently. And we always will. As the sun set outside the window, Malachi felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The truth had been revealed, justice achieved, and now the future was his to define. The faint hum of computers and the chatter of a small team filled the modest but modern office space. Malachi sat at his desk, surrounded by vision boards and project outlines for his new startup, a consultancy dedicated to helping young entrepreneurs navigate the business world. Hey, boss, called Maya, his first hire and operations manager. The mentorship program applications are through the roof. People are loving the mission. Malachi grinned. Good problem to have. Let's set up a system to review them efficiently. As Maya walked away, Malachi's gaze shifted to a framed photo of himself and Leona on his desk. This wasn't just his success, it was theirs. He had built something from the ground up, something rooted in values that honored his mother's sacrifices. The office door opened, and Elijah stepped inside, looking slightly out of place in his casual attire. Hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, Malachi said, motioning for him to sit. What's up? Elijah hesitated, then said, I wanted to see how things were going. You've really built something here. Thanks, Malachi said. It's a work in progress, but it feels good. Elijah leaned forward. I've been thinking about getting involved in something meaningful too. Maybe I could learn from you. Malachi raised an eyebrow, surprised but pleased. You're serious? Yeah, Elijah said, his voice steady. I want to make a difference, not just inherit one. Malachi nodded. All right, let's figure it out together. The community center buzzed with energy as attendees gathered for the annual awards banquet. Malachi sat at a table near the stage, watching proudly as Leona ascended the podium to accept an award for her contributions to the local community. Leona adjusted the microphone, her hands steady despite the weight of the moment. This recognition isn't just for me, she began. It's for every person who has faced adversity and found the strength to rise above it. I stand here today because of the love and support of my son, Malachi. He taught me that our past doesn't define us. Our choices do. The room erupted in applause. Malachi felt a lump in his throat as Leona stepped down, her smile radiant. She returned to the table and took his hand. You did this, she said softly. You made me believe in myself again. No, Mom, Malachi replied. You've always been the strongest person I know. I just reminded you of it. Later that evening, Malachi and Elijah walked along a quiet city street, the distant sounds of traffic filling the air. I've been thinking about what you said, Elijah began. About not letting our parents' choices define us. Malachi nodded, keeping his pace slow. It's not easy, but it's worth it. Elijah looked at him, a hint of vulnerability in his usually confident demeanor. Do you think we can be brothers? I mean, really? After everything? Malachi stopped, turning to face him. We're already brothers, Elijah. The question is whether we can build something real on top of that. I'd like to try, Elijah said, extending his hand. Malachi smiled, shaking it firmly. Then let's start with this. Victor Langston sat on a park bench, a paperback novel in hand. The towering skyscrapers of the city loomed in the background, a reminder of the life he'd left behind. An older woman sitting nearby struck up a conversation. You look familiar. Didn't you used to run Meridian Enterprises? Victor smiled faintly. I did, a long time ago. Must have been quite the job, she said. It was, Victor admitted. But sometimes stepping away gives you the clarity to see what really matters. He glanced at his phone, where a new message from Malachi awaited. Dinner next week? I'll bring Elijah. Victor replied with a simple, looking forward to it. As the woman wandered off, Victor leaned back, letting the warmth of the sun wash over him. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. Malachi sat at his desk late one evening, the glow of his computer screen illuminating the room. A blank document stared back at him, the cursor blinking expectantly. Taking a deep breath, he began to type. This is the story of resilience, betrayal, and redemption. It's the story of my mother, who taught me the meaning of strength, and the father who showed me the cost of ambition. But most importantly, it's the story of reclaiming a legacy, not of power, but of hope. As the words flowed, Malachi felt a sense of closure. He wasn't just writing their story, he was ensuring it would inspire others. Leona entered, holding 2 mugs of tea. Still working? Yeah, Malachi said, smiling. But it doesn't feel like work. Leona set a mug beside him and kissed his forehead. I'm proud of you. Malachi looked up at her, his heart full. I'm proud of us. The journey had been long and painful, but they had emerged stronger, united by the truth and a shared determination to build something better. Together, they had redefined their legacy, not as victims of the past, but as architects of a brighter future.